My name is Joan Fletcher. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my life, I've occupied a space that's easy to overlook. I'm an accountant by training, the kind who shows up early, leaves quietly, and rarely interrupts a room to announce what I know. The kind people trust with responsibility, but not with attention. If you asked the people around me to describe who I was, they would probably say I was fine. Competent. Dependable. Not someone they worried about, but also not someone they expected much from. Especially not my parents. In a family where success was measured loudly, titles, prestige, visible acceleration, I represented something slower, less impressive. I chose stability over spectacle, precision over performance. This story isn't about me becoming someone extraordinary overnight. It's not about revenge, or winning arguments, or humiliating anyone who doubted me. It's about a long stretch of being quietly dismissed, and what happens when that dismissal shapes how others treat you, and eventually, how you treat yourself. For years, I was labelled a mediocre accountant. Not incompetent, just unremarkable. And the thing about that word, mediocre, is that it doesn't sting sharply. It settles. It gives people permission to stop expecting more from you. It gave my parents permission to withdraw their support, first subtly, then completely. Emotionally at first, then financially, then eventually altogether. When they cut me off, I didn't protest. I didn't argue my case or list my accomplishments. I told myself that this was simply the cost of not being impressive enough. I internalized the idea that my life was small because it looked quiet from the outside. What I didn't realize then was that silence can look like stagnation to people who only understand noise. This story unfolds slowly because that's how real erosion happens, through moments that don't feel important enough to confront. A joke that lands a little too close to the truth, a comparison that's framed as concern, a conversation that assumes you'll always be in the same place, doing the same thing, needing nothing more. I stayed where I was. I kept working. I kept learning. I paid attention to details others skipped over. I noticed patterns. I documented inconsistencies. I didn't announce what I was doing because at the time, I didn't even realize it would matter. And then much later, recognition arrived. Not the kind you plan for, not the kind you ask permission to receive. It came publicly, unexpectedly, and long after doubt had already done its damage. It came in a way that couldn't be reframed or minimized, and it came from a place none of us could ignore. This is a story about delayed acknowledgement, about how sometimes your value isn't revealed when you're ready for it, but when the world finally catches up, about how being underestimated can either shrink you or quietly sharpen you. I'm sharing this not to rewrite the past, but to document it honestly, because many people live capable, disciplined lives while being told, explicitly or subtly, that they are just enough to be useful, but never enough to be significant. So before I go any further, I want to ask you something, gently and sincerely. Have you ever had someone decide who you were, long before you had the chance to become who you actually are? To the people closest to me, I was never a disappointment in a dramatic sense. I wasn't reckless. I didn't fail out of school. I paid my bills on time. I showed up when I said I would. In many ways, I was the safest version of a child you could have. And that, I eventually learned, was the problem. In my family, value was measured by velocity, how fast you rose, how visibly you advanced. My parents admired people who announced promotions, who changed titles often, who spoke in big plans and bigger predictions. Dinner conversations were full of names I was expected to recognize, executives, partners, people who had made it. Success to them was something you could point at. When it came to me, they struggled to point. I studied accounting because it made sense to me. I liked the order. I liked clarity. I liked knowing that if you looked closely enough, the truth was always there, balanced and precise. But accounting didn't come with applause. There were no dramatic reveals, no visible milestones that impressed anyone outside the room. So to my parents, I became the stable one. That phrase sounds kind, almost complimentary, but it came with an unspoken ending, and therefore unremarkable. They stopped asking about my work in detail. When relatives visited, my career was summarized quickly, and then the conversation moved on. My younger cousins were encouraged to aim higher. I was encouraged to be grateful. I learned early how to make myself smaller without disappearing. I didn't correct people when they misunderstood what I did. I didn't mention the complexity of my work or the responsibility I carried. When someone joked that accounting was basically just data entry, I smiled politely. It felt easier than explaining myself to people who weren't really listening. At family gatherings, I became useful in quiet ways. I helped plan budgets for trips. I reviewed documents. I explained taxes. I was consulted privately, then ignored publicly. My competence was something they relied on, but not something they respected. And I absorbed that distinction without realizing how deeply it was shaping me. To my parents, I was predictable. I was the daughter they didn't worry about, and eventually, the daughter they didn't invest in. When conversations turned to financial help, networking, or strategic support, the assumption was that I didn't need it. Or worse, that it wouldn't make a difference. They never said they were disappointed. They said things like, "You seem comfortable where you are," or "Not everyone needs to be exceptional." Statements that sounded reasonable, but landed like ceilings. I didn't argue. Part of me believed them. Another part of me didn't know how to translate my inner discipline into something they could recognize. So I stayed quiet. I focused on being reliable. I told myself that being underestimated was harmless, maybe even freeing. But invisibility has weight. Over time, I noticed how decisions were made without me in mind. Opportunities were discussed as if I wouldn't understand them. My future was spoken about in the past tense, as it had already reached its limit. When I tried to share a goal, it was met with polite surprise, then quickly redirected. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly I felt distant. Like I was watching a version of myself being described that didn't quite match who I was becoming internally. I felt capable in my own life, but strangely absent in theirs. What hurt most wasn't the lack of praise. It was the assumption. The quiet agreement everyone seemed to share, that I would always be in the background, steady and sufficient, but never central. I didn't know then that being underestimated would become the condition that shaped everything that followed. I just knew that to them, I had already been defined. And definitions, once accepted, are hard to escape. The first time it happened, it was so small that I almost missed it. We were sitting at my parents' kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon. Nothing tense, nothing dramatic. The kind of day where the windows were open, the conversation drifted easily, and no one expected anything important to be said. My mother was talking about a friend's daughter, new job, impressive title, fast trajectory. My father nodded along, adding details like he'd been personally invested in the story. I listened quietly, as I usually did. At some point, my father turned to me and asked, almost as an afterthought, "So, Joan, you're still at the same company, right?" "Still?" I said yes. I added that I'd recently taken on more responsibility, that I was overseeing a broader portfolio now, working directly with compliance and audit teams. I didn't oversell it. I never did. I just stated it plainly, the way I'd learned to speak about my life. My mother smiled politely and said, "Well, consistency is good. Some people just aren't built for all that pressure." She didn't mean it as an insult. That's what made it worse. The conversation moved on immediately. No follow-up questions, no curiosity, just a subtle redirection back to safer, shinier topics. I sat there, nodding, chewing my food, telling myself it didn't matter. But something had shifted. That was the first small cut. Not the words themselves, but the ease with which my reality was dismissed. It wasn't rejection. It was something quieter. A gentle lowering of expectations that I hadn't agreed to. No one else at the table noticed. Why would they? Nothing rude had been said. No voices were raised. If I brought it up later, it would sound petty, oversensitive. So I did what I always did. I stored it away. After that, similar moments began to appear everywhere. A relative asked me to help review a contract, then introduced me later as just good with paperwork. A family friend joked that I must have plenty of free time since accounting was pretty routine. Each comment was small enough to dismiss on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. What struck me wasn't malice, it was an assumption. People had decided who I was without needing confirmation. They spoke to a version of me that felt simplified, flattened, and I started responding to that version because correcting them felt exhausting. I told myself it wasn't worth pushing back, that this was just how families were, that I didn't need their validation to be confident in my work. And that was true, to a point. But what I didn't realize then was how these moments were quietly teaching others how to treat me. The first real consequence came a few months later, when my parents were discussing financial support for a family event. Contributions were being offered, amounts mentioned casually. When it came to me, there was a pause. "Well," my father said, "Joan's doing fine, but we shouldn't put pressure on her." I wasn't asked. The decision was made for me. That pause, that assumption, landed harder than the comment at the dinner table. It wasn't about money, it was about placement. I had been categorized as someone whose capacity was limited, whose ambition was modest, whose ceiling was already visible. I smiled and said nothing. Again. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the conversation. Not angrily, carefully, like reviewing a ledger line by line. I realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't a one-off misunderstanding. It was the beginning of a role being quietly reinforced. And I was participating in it, by staying silent, by minimizing myself, by choosing peace over clarity. I was allowing that version of me to solidify in their minds. The cut was small, but it was precise. And once made, it didn't heal, it widened. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't make a mental vow to prove them wrong. I just became more aware, more attentive. I started noticing how often I was underestimated and how often I let it happen. At the time, I thought awareness was enough. I didn't yet understand that noticing something doesn't stop it from shaping you. Once the first small cut had been made, it didn't stay alone for long. It was followed by others, similar in shape, similar in tone, until the presence of them felt almost normal, not painful enough to demand attention, just persistent enough to change how I moved through conversations. Disrespect, I learned, rarely announces itself. It settles in quietly, disguised as familiarity. I began to notice how often my opinions were received with polite tolerance rather than engagement. At family dinners, I would offer a measured thought about finances, policy changes, or long-term planning, topics I understood deeply. Someone would nod, thank me, and then turn to someone else to ask the same question in a different form. When that person answered, the room would listen. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was being sensitive, that I didn't need to be the center of attention anyway. I had never wanted that. But slowly, I started adjusting my behavior to match the role others seemed to expect. I spoke less. I kept my answers shorter. I stopped volunteering insights unless directly asked. I became efficient in conversation, not expansive. What surprised me was how quickly everyone adapted. The less I spoke, the more people filled in the silence for me. They summarized my thoughts before I finished them. They made decisions on my behalf. They assumed I would agree, and often I did, because disagreeing felt like unnecessary friction. At work, something similar was happening, though in a subtler form. I was trusted with complex tasks, but rarely included in high-level discussions about them. I would prepare detailed analyses, only to see my conclusions presented later by someone else, stripped of nuance, but applauded nonetheless. When colleagues thanked me privately, I accepted it as enough. I told myself recognition didn't matter as long as the work was solid. That integrity was its own reward. And for a long time, that belief held. But normalization is dangerous. Once something becomes routine, you stop questioning whether it should exist at all. I began to internalize the idea that my value was operational, not intellectual, that I was there to support, not to lead, to execute, not to shape. This wasn't something anyone explicitly told me. It was something I absorbed through repetition. My parents reinforced it without realizing they were doing so. They stopped asking about my aspirations altogether. When I mentioned future plans, they responded with concern instead of curiosity. "That sounds stressful," they'd say, or, "Are you sure you want to complicate things?" It was always framed as care. I learned to translate those responses as instructions. Stay where you are, don't ask for more, don't disrupt the balance. And because I didn't want to seem ungrateful or dramatic, I complied. Looking back, what hurts most isn't that they underestimated me. It's what I helped them do. I remember one specific evening, nothing significant on the surface. My parents were discussing a financial decision involving extended family. I listened, noticed a flaw in the plan, and gently pointed it out. My father waved it off. "We've already thought it through," he said. Later that night, I overheard him on the phone, repeating my exact concern to someone else, this time with urgency. The next morning, the plan had changed. No one mentioned me, I didn't confront him. I didn't demand credit. I just noted it. Another entry in a growing internal record. Not for revenge, but for understanding. I started keeping track of these moments the way I tracked numbers, objectively, unemotionally. I wasn't angry. I was curious. How had this become acceptable? How had I become so easy to overlook? The answer, I realized, was consistency. I had been consistently calm, consistently capable, consistently quiet. And people had mistaken that for a lack of depth. So I adapted again. I lowered my expectations, not of myself, but of how others would see me. I stopped hoping for recognition. I stopped anticipating support. I built a kind of emotional insulation, telling myself that independence was safer than disappointment. What I didn't realize was that this insulation also created distance, not just between them, but between me and my own sense of possibility. By normalizing disrespect, I had made it invisible, and invisible things are the hardest to remove. At the time, I believed this was just the cost of peace. I didn't yet understand that peace built on self-erasure is always temporary. By the time I became fully aware of the role I was playing, it had already been rehearsed for years. I was the reliable one, the steady one, the person who could be counted on to handle details without needing recognition or reassurance. In my family, that role came with responsibility, but not authority, trust, but not influence. I began to notice how predictably I was placed into this position, regardless of context. If something needed to be organized, reviewed, explained, or fixed quietly, it came to me. If something needed to be decided, announced, or celebrated, it happened elsewhere. No one said this out loud. It didn't need to be said. Roles, once established, communicate themselves. At family events, I was the one asked to arrive early and stay late, to help clean up, to manage logistics, to smooth over tensions. People relied on my calmness to absorb stress, so they didn't have to. And I provided it, because saying no felt like breaking an unspoken contract. The contract was simple: I would be useful, and in return, I would not demand visibility. At work, the pattern mirrored itself. I was known as someone who could be trusted with sensitive information, someone who wouldn't overreact, someone who would just handle it. When projects went well, they were framed as team successes. When something went wrong, I was expected to quietly correct it. I didn't resent this at first. There was a sense of control in being the person others depended on, a quiet pride in competence. But over time, I realized that dependency wasn't the same as respect. Respect invites you into the room before decisions are made. Dependency calls you in after something has already gone wrong. My parents saw me through this same lens. When the extended family needed advice on finances, I was consulted privately. When conversations turned to ambition or future planning, I was excluded. It was as if my role was to maintain stability, not to disrupt it with vision. One evening, my mother said something that clarified everything. We were alone, folding laundry, the television humming in the background. She looked at me and said, "You've always been so low maintenance, Joan. We never had to worry about you." She meant it as praise. But what I heard was finality. Low maintenance meant they didn't need to check in. It meant my needs were assumed to be minimal. It meant my growth was invisible unless it caused a problem. In being easy, I had made myself ignorable. That night, I sat with the discomfort of that realization. Not anger, recognition. I saw how my silence had been interpreted as contentment. How my independence had been mistaken for a lack of ambition. How my calm had been read as emotional self-sufficiency. I also saw how difficult it would be to change this perception. Once people are comfortable with a version of you, they resist updates. They prefer the familiar role, even if it no longer fits. So I stopped trying to correct it. Not out of defeat, but out of clarity. I began to understand that pushing against a role assigned by others often leads to resistance, especially when that role benefits them. So instead of challenging it directly, I observed it. I studied how it functioned, what it allowed me access to, what it denied me. Being the reliable one meant I was trusted with information others weren't. It meant people spoke freely around me, assuming I was neutral, unthreatening. It meant I could move between spaces without raising suspicion. I hadn't chosen this role, but I could choose how to use it. At the time, I didn't yet know what that would look like. I only knew that I was done trying to be seen by people who were invested in not seeing me. If recognition ever came, it wouldn't come from correcting their assumptions. It would come from moving beyond the limits they'd placed on me. This wasn't a declaration. No one noticed a change. Outwardly, I remained the same. Calm, capable, agreeable. Internally, something had shifted. I stopped measuring my worth by how visible I was to them. I started measuring it by how prepared I was for what came next. The day something shifted didn't come with an argument or a dramatic realization. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no decisive moment where I stood up and declared a new version of myself. It was quieter than that, almost unremarkable on the surface. I was at work, sitting in a small conference room with no windows, reviewing a set of financial statements tied to a government contract. This wasn't unusual. I'd done this kind of work many times before. The numbers were clean at first glance, balanced the way they were supposed to be, but something felt off. I couldn't have explained it immediately, just a faint sense of misalignment, a pattern that didn't quite resolve. So I stayed late that evening, long after most of the office had emptied. I spread the documents out, cross-referencing timelines, tracing transactions back to their origins. What I found wasn't explosive. It wasn't criminal in the dramatic sense people imagine. It was subtle. Misclassifications, timing adjustments, internal transfers that technically complied with the letter of the law while violating its spirit. The kind of thing most people wouldn't notice, or wouldn't bother to look for. I documented it carefully, not because I intended to report it right away, but because documentation was instinctive to me. Clarity before reaction, understanding before action. As I worked, I felt something unfamiliar. Not excitement, not fear, but focus. A deep, steady concentration that made everything else recede. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about how others perceived me. I wasn't wondering if this would impress anyone. I was simply engaged, fully, in what I was good at. That night, walking home, I realized the shift hadn't come from what I found, but from how I felt finding it. I didn't need to be visible to be effective. I didn't need permission to be competent. And I didn't need validation to know when something mattered. Around the same time, something small happened at home. My parents had called to tell me they were adjusting their financial plans. Nothing urgent, just an update. During the conversation, my father mentioned that they'd decided to redirect some resources and that I would need to be more independent going forward. It was said calmly, casually. I said I understood, I meant it. After we hung up, I didn't feel hurt. I felt released, as if a weight I hadn't acknowledged had been lifted. The expectation that they might eventually recognize me, support me, change their view, it dissolved quietly. That was the moment, not when I was cut off, but when I stopped waiting. I began to see how much energy I had been spending managing other people's expectations. How often I'd adjusted my tone, my goals, my pace to remain acceptable. Letting go of that didn't make me reckless, it made me precise. From then on, silence stopped being something that happened to me. It became something I chose. At work, I continued exactly as before on the surface. Same demeanor, same reliability, but internally, I was sharper, more deliberate. I followed threads others ignored. I kept records no one asked for. I learned which systems spoke to which regulators, which reports carried weight beyond internal meetings. I wasn't planning anything grand. I wasn't plotting exposure or recognition. I was aligning myself with reality instead of perception. At home, I did something similar. I stopped explaining myself. When my parents offered advice, I listened without defending or correcting. I didn't seek their approval or their concern. I simply stepped out of the emotional negotiation. What surprised me most was how quickly the space filled. Without the need to perform or justify, I had more attention for what actually mattered. My work deepened. My thinking is clarified. I became more patient. Not because I was enduring, but because I was choosing my timing. The shift wasn't visible. No one commented on it, but I felt it in how I moved through my days. Less reactive, less tethered, more grounded. For the first time, I understood that waiting to be seen is a form of dependency. And I was done depending. I didn't know then where this path would lead. I only knew that I had crossed a quiet threshold, one that couldn't be uncrossed. After that quiet shift, my silence changed character. Before, it had been a response, something shaped by politeness, self-protection, or fatigue. Now, it was intentional, measured, almost strategic. I wasn't withdrawing, I was conserving. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing had changed. I still spoke when spoken to. I still delivered work on time. I still showed up to family events and listened more than I talked. But internally, my silence was no longer passive. It was an active filter. I started choosing what deserved my energy. At work, I noticed how often people spoke without saying anything meaningful. Meetings were filled with repetition, posturing, and safe conclusions. I began to speak less, not because I had less to contribute, but because I was waiting for moments where precision mattered. When I did speak, it was brief, focused, hard to dismiss. People would pause, nod, then move on, sometimes not fully understanding what I'd said, but sensing its weight. I didn't elaborate unless asked, and often I wasn't. That was fine. Silence, I learned, unsettles people more than disagreement. When you stop explaining yourself, others are forced to fill in the gaps, and they rarely do it accurately. Some colleagues began to assume I was disengaged. Others thought I was simply content where I was. A few mistook my restraint for a lack of ambition. None of that concerned me anymore. Their assumptions were no longer something I needed to manage. At home, the shift was even more pronounced. My parents continued to offer advice framed as concern. They asked fewer questions and made more statements. I listened, responded neutrally, and didn't correct their misconceptions. When my mother said, "You've always been happy with simple things," I didn't argue. I let the sentence exist on its own. When my father suggested I should avoid unnecessary risks, I nodded. They took my agreement as confirmation. What they didn't see was that my silence had given me space to plan. Not in the dramatic sense, but in the structural one. I was no longer reacting emotionally to their expectations. I was operating independently of them. This quiet autonomy was misunderstood as stagnation. I could feel it in the way people spoke around me. Conversations assumed I would stay exactly where I was. Future scenarios didn't include me as a variable. Decisions were made with the confidence that my trajectory was fixed. And that misunderstanding worked in my favor, because while others were certain of who I was becoming something they hadn't accounted for. I spent more time observing systems, how information flowed, where authority actually lived, which voices mattered in which contexts. I noticed how public recognition often lagged behind real influence, how the people doing the most consequential work were rarely the loudest. This wasn't bitterness, it was alignment. I began documenting everything more carefully. Not because I expected conflict, but because I understood how quickly narratives could shift when facts were involved. I learned which standards governed which decisions, which errors were tolerated, and which ones quietly escalated. I didn't share this with anyone. Not because it was secretive, but because it wasn't for them. Silence gave me clarity. And clarity gave me patience. People around me grew comfortable. They stopped checking in. They assumed I was stable, settled, predictable. That assumption lowered their guard, not in a dramatic way, but in small, cumulative ones. I was invited into rooms because I was considered safe, non-threatening, reliable. And in those rooms, people spoke freely. They overlooked me. They underestimated what I noticed. There's a particular kind of power in being overlooked. Not the kind that comes from manipulation, but from absence of projection. When people don't see you as a contender, they stop managing what they show you. I didn't exploit that. I simply paid attention. Silence, when chosen, isn't weakness. It's a refusal to perform, a way of letting others reveal themselves fully. At the time, I still didn't know how this would resolve. I wasn't aiming for a moment of recognition. I wasn't anticipating a reveal. I was simply building something internal, an understanding, a readiness that didn't require anyone else's acknowledgement to be real. And in that quiet space, the groundwork was being laid for everything that followed. What no one seemed to notice was how much my stillness concealed. From the outside, my life looked unchanged. Same job, same routines, same unremarkable pace. People assumed that consistency meant stasis, that because I wasn't announcing progress, there wasn't any. But beneath that surface, something deliberate was happening. I began treating my days the way I treated complex financial systems. Nothing wasted, everything accounted for. I paid close attention to how decisions were justified, how exceptions were explained, and how responsibility was distributed when outcomes were unclear. I wasn't looking for wrongdoing. I was learning the language of consequence. At work, I volunteered for projects others avoided, not because they were difficult, but because they were tedious. Compliance reviews, audit reconciliations, long-term reporting that spanned multiple fiscal years, the kind of work that required patience more than charisma. Most people saw these tasks as career dead ends. I saw them as maps. Patterns emerged when you stayed long enough. You began to see which inconsistencies were accidental and which ones were structural. You learned which shortcuts were habitual and which ones were strategic. And most importantly, you learned who benefited from complexity and who depended on it remaining unexamined. I documented everything meticulously, not in a way that disrupted workflows or drew attention, but in a way that preserved context, dates, versions, rationales. I kept copies of communications, noting not just what was said, but when and by whom. This wasn't paranoia, it was professionalism taken seriously. At the same time, I invested quietly in my own education. I studied regulatory frameworks that intersected with my work, government oversight, public accountability, and ethics compliance. I didn't announce this, I didn't ask for permission. I learned because understanding gave me leverage, whether I ever used it or not. Outside of work, I did something similar with my personal life. I reorganized my finances, not because I was struggling, but because independence required clarity. I built buffers, reduced dependencies, made sure that if support was withdrawn, nothing essential would collapse. My parents never noticed these changes. They assumed I was still operating within the limits they'd defined for me. When they spoke about me to others, they described me as settled, low-key, not chasing anything. I let them, because chasing had never been my method. What they also didn't notice was how much access I had. Being perceived as non-threatening opened doors. People shared information with me casually, assuming I wouldn't use it beyond its immediate purpose. They spoke freely in my presence, confident I was simply there to support their conclusions. I listened. I asked neutral questions, not challenging ones, clarifying ones, the kind that encouraged people to explain themselves more fully. Often they did. And in those explanations, gaps appeared. I didn't confront those gaps. I logged them mentally, sometimes literally. I wasn't building a case against anyone. I was building understanding. What surprised me most during this time was how calm I felt. There was no urgency, no pressure to act. Preparation, I realized, is most effective when it's not rushed. When you're not trying to force an outcome, you can wait for the right alignment. This was a stark contrast to how my parents operated. They believed in visible momentum, in pushing, in accelerating. They often asked why I was still doing what I was doing. I answered honestly, because it mattered. They heard resignation. I meant precision. The irony was that the very traits they dismissed, patience, attention to detail, emotional restraint, were the ones allowing me to move freely through complex systems. I wasn't blocked by ego or urgency. I wasn't distracted by recognition. I was present. There's a particular clarity that comes from not needing to be seen. When no one is watching you closely, you can study without interference. You can learn without defending yourself. You can prepare without pressure. That was the gift of being underestimated. By the time subtle questions began forming in my mind about responsibility, about accountability, about the broader impact of certain decisions, I already had the framework to explore them. I knew which channels existed, which standards applied, which conversations mattered. Still, I said nothing, not because I was afraid, but because I understood that timing wasn't about readiness, it was about inevitability. And inevitability requires patience. What they never noticed was that while they thought my life was standing still, I was positioning myself somewhere they couldn't see yet, somewhere that didn't require their approval to exist. By the time anyone realized something had changed, the groundwork would already be complete. The reveal, when it came, wasn't cinematic. There was no rush of adrenaline, no moment where I leaned back in my chair and thought, this is it. It happened quietly, the way most truths do, through accumulation. I was reviewing a consolidated report late one evening, cross-checking figures that spanned several years. This wasn't assigned work anymore. This was something I had chosen to look at because a few small discrepancies, noted months apart, had never fully resolved in my mind. Individually, they were explainable. Together, they told a story. What emerged wasn't a single error or a clear violation. It was something more complex and more serious. A pattern of financial reporting that consistently shifted risk away from public accountability and into opaque internal structures. Everything was technically defensible, nothing was clearly illegal, but the intent was unmistakable. I remember sitting there, the office nearly empty, realizing that I wasn't just looking at numbers anymore. I was looking at responsibility, diffused so carefully that no one person could be easily blamed. It was elegant and deeply flawed. The realization didn't excite me, it steadied me. This was the moment I understood what I had been preparing for, even without naming it. Not exposure, not confrontation, but comprehension at a level that couldn't be undone by dismissal or mischaracterization. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Instead, I verified it. I went back further. I traced similar structures across different projects. I compared the language used in reports, noting how phrasing shifted when oversight increased. I looked at how decisions were documented and how often key rationales were left unwritten. This took time, weeks, months. And during that time, nothing about my external life changed. I still went to family dinners. I still listened to my parents talk about other people's successes. They still described me as steady, comfortable, not ambitious. I nodded, I smiled, I passed the bread. What they didn't see was that I had reached a point of internal clarity that made their assessments irrelevant. The private reveal wasn't about discovering leverage over anyone. It was about discovering my own position. I now understood exactly where I stood within the system, and more importantly, where the system stood in relation to the standards it claimed to uphold. That distinction mattered, because leverage without ethics is just coercion, and I had no interest in that. I began consulting quietly with the frameworks I had studied, not with people, with principles. I asked myself what responsibility looked like in this context. What obligation came with awareness? What timing would allow for correction rather than collapse? I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I felt clear, almost calm to the point of detachment. When you see something fully, emotion often gives way to precision. There was also a sobering realization. If this information became public in the wrong way, it would affect people far beyond those who designed the system. Employees, communities, programs that depended on stability. This wasn't about being right, it was about being careful. That's when I understood why I had been invisible for so long. Invisibility had given me access without expectation. It had allowed me to see without being seen, and now that seeing carries weight, I made a decision then. Not about action, but about restraint. I would not move until I was certain. I would not speak until I understood the consequences of being heard. At the same time, something personal settled inside me. For years, I had measured myself against my parents' definition of success. Their timelines, their benchmarks, their assumptions about what mattered. Sitting alone in that office, surrounded by evidence of quiet systemic failure, I realized how small those definitions were. Not wrong, just incomplete. My work mattered, my attention mattered, my restraint mattered, and whether or not my parents ever understood that no longer felt urgent. The reveal stayed private, not because it was secret, but because it was unfinished. I wasn't ready to share it, and the world wasn't ready to receive it responsibly. So I kept going, refining, confirming, positioning. Not in silence born of fear, but in silence born of respect for complexity. I didn't know then that this clarity would soon force a choice. One that couldn't be undone. One that would eventually bring recognition I hadn't asked for, in a way I couldn't control. For now, it was enough to know the truth and to hold it carefully. Once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. That was the weight I carried after the private reveal. Not fear, not excitement, but responsibility. Knowledge doesn't demand action immediately, but it does eliminate innocence. From that point on, doing nothing would no longer be neutral. I gave myself time. Not to delay, but to think honestly. There were several paths open to me, and I examined each one the way I examined everything else. Slowly, without romance. I could stay silent indefinitely, let the system continue as it was. That path offered comfort, stability, no risk. It was the path everyone assumed I would take. I could also speak internally, raise concerns quietly, in the same rooms that had always minimized me. But I understood that route too well. Without structural protection, concerns become opinions. Opinions become inconveniences, and inconveniences get managed away. There was also the option of exposure. Dramatic, immediate, irreversible. The kind of action people fantasize about when they talk about justice. But I knew enough to understand how careless that would be. Shock creates noise, not resolution, and noise often harms the wrong people first. None of those options felt aligned. What I was really deciding wasn't whether to act, but how to act without becoming what I despised: reactive, performative, careless with consequences. During this time, my parents called less often. When they did, the conversations were efficient. They assumed I was doing fine, that I was settled into a modest, predictable life. There was no malice in their distance, just certainty. Strangely, that certainty gave me peace. I realized something important. I was no longer trying to prove anything to them. Not my intelligence, not my ambition, not my worth. Their understanding, or lack of it, had finally lost its grip on my decisions. That freedom sharpened the choice in front of me. The irreversible option wasn't dramatic exposure. It was alignment. I decided that if I acted, I would do so within the structures that already existed, but were rarely tested by someone like me. I would let the process speak, let standards do the work, let truth move at a pace that could be sustained. This meant preparation on a different level. I reviewed protections, not loopholes, safeguards. I ensured that documentation was complete, contextualized, and impossible to misinterpret without deliberate effort. I confirmed that what I had seen wasn't unique to my perspective, that it held under scrutiny. I also prepared myself for something else: misunderstanding. I knew that if this ever surfaced, it would not look like a personal triumph. It would look administrative, procedural, boring even, and that was exactly how it needed to be. Quiet dominance isn't about being seen as powerful. It's about being impossible to ignore once you act. The final decision came one evening at home. I was sitting alone, reviewing notes, when I realized I had stopped asking myself what this cost me and started asking what it cost if I didn't. That shift told me everything. I chose the path that couldn't be reversed, not because it was risky, but because it was clean. Once taken, there would be no dramatic reveal, no moment where I could pull back and pretend I hadn't seen what I saw. I would step out of the role I had been assigned, reliable, invisible, harmless, and into one defined by accountability, whether or not anyone recognized my name. At the time, I didn't feel brave. I felt settled. Some decisions don't feel like leaps. They feel like gravity is finally being acknowledged. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell my colleagues. I didn't tell anyone. The next steps would happen in silence, through systems that moved slowly but decisively. By the time the effects were felt, the choice would already be far behind me, and there would be no way to pretend it hadn't been made. Once the decision was made, the movement that followed was almost anticlimactic. There were no dramatic emails, no secret meetings, no whispered phone calls late at night. Everything I did fit neatly inside existing procedures, forms already created, channels already designated, standards already written. I wasn't inventing a new path. I was finally walking on one that had always been there. That was the quiet genius of it. I began by organizing my documentation into something that could be understood by someone who had never met me. Someone with no emotional context, no personal history, no reason to doubt or defend me. Every note was neutral. Every timeline is clear. Every conclusion is traceable back to verifiable data. I removed myself from the narrative as much as possible. This wasn't about me discovering something. It was about patterns that existed regardless of who noticed them. The less personal it felt, the more durable it became. At work, nothing changed on the surface. I still attended meetings, still completed assignments, still responded promptly. People continued to assume I was exactly who I had always been: competent, calm, non-ambitious. That assumption protected me, because no one monitors someone they believe poses no risk. I submitted materials through the appropriate channels, spaced out over time. Not in a way that suggested urgency, but in a way that suggested diligence. Each piece of information stood on its own. Together, they formed something that could not be dismissed as a coincidence. No one reacted immediately. I didn't expect them to. Systems like this don't move quickly, and they don't announce themselves when they begin to turn. They gather, they verify, they cross-check. Silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It often means everything is happening out of sight. During this period, my parents invited me to dinner. It was casual, comfortable. They spoke about renovations, travel plans, and people they'd recently met. At one point, my mother asked, "Work still going smoothly?" I said yes. That was the truth. They interpreted my answer the way they always had, as confirmation that nothing notable was happening, that my life remained stable, modest, and predictable. I didn't correct them. What I noticed instead was how detached I felt from their assumptions. Not resentful, just separate. Their expectations no longer shaped my self-image or my decisions. They existed in parallel, not in control. As weeks passed, subtle shifts began occurring around me, small enough that no one connected them to anything specific. Requests for clarification, slight changes in reporting requirements. A new layer of review was added quietly to processes that had once been taken for granted. People grumbled about bureaucracy. I listened. Still, no one looked at me differently. I was still the background presence, the one who handled details, the one who didn't stir things up. And that was the point. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy, it's about alignment. When your actions are consistent with established standards, they don't trigger immediate resistance. They simply progress. I felt no rush, no anticipation of a reveal. There was nothing to reveal yet. What I felt instead was steadiness. A sense that I had finally stopped negotiating with doubt, both others and my own. For the first time, I wasn't bracing for a reaction. I wasn't waiting to be misunderstood. I had accepted that misunderstanding was likely and irrelevant. Whatever happened next would not depend on how persuasively I spoke or how confidently I presented myself. It would depend on the integrity of the work. And integrity, once set in motion, doesn't need an audience. By the time anyone began to notice that something had changed, the change itself would already be embedded. Not announced, not dramatic, just present. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was doing exactly what I needed it to do. The first signs appeared quietly, the way pressure does before anything visibly cracks. At work, processes that had once moved smoothly began to slow. Not dramatically, just enough to be noticed by the people who relied on them most. Approvals took longer. Requests came back with additional questions. Reports that had previously been accepted without comment were now returned for clarification. No one knew why. People speculated, of course. Someone mentioned new oversight. Someone else blamed shifting priorities. A few complained about inefficiency, but no one connected these changes to a specific person, let alone to me. That invisibility remained intact. What changed was the atmosphere. Conversations became more cautious. People chose their words more carefully. Documentation grew more thorough, less casual. There was a subtle tension, not panic, but awareness. The kind that emerges when people realize that something they took for granted is now being observed. I watched this unfold without satisfaction. Consequences, when they begin properly, aren't theatrical. They don't single out villains or deliver instant clarity. They ripple outward, affecting systems first, then people. At home, something similar was happening, though in a different register. My parents began asking questions again. At first, they were casual. "Have you heard anything about changes in your industry? Is work still steady?" The tone had shifted. There was curiosity now, edged with something else, uncertainty. I answered honestly, but minimally. Yes, there were changes. Yes, things were more scrutinized. No, I didn't elaborate. They filled in the blanks themselves. What I noticed was that they were no longer assuming I was uninvolved. They weren't crediting me with anything yet, but the certainty they once had about my insignificance had begun to erode. At work, people began to feel the consequences more personally. A project was delayed pending review. A decision that had once been rubber-stamped was flagged for reassessment. These weren't accusations, there were questions. And questions are destabilizing when you're used to operating without them. I remained exactly where I had always been, calm, cooperative, precise. When asked for information, I provided it. When asked for clarification, I gave it. I didn't speculate. I didn't editorialize. This neutrality unsettled some people. A colleague once said to me, half joking, "You're always so unbothered. Don't you ever get nervous?" I smiled and said, "About what?" It wasn't defiance, it was accurate. What surprised me most was how quickly others began to feel exposed. Not because they were being accused, but because the environment no longer protected carelessness. Systems that depend on opacity become fragile under attention. The consequences weren't about punishment, they were about friction. At home, the friction took a different form. My parents mentioned money more often, not directly, but in passing. Concerns about planning, about uncertainty, about needing to be more careful. I listened. They didn't ask me for advice, not yet. But the distance between how they saw me and how they needed me was narrowing. That realization didn't give me pleasure. If anything, it made me more reserved. Because this wasn't about reclaiming a role in their lives. It was about staying aligned with the decision I'd already made. The moment I started seeking acknowledgement would be the moment I compromised the work. And I refused to do that. As the weeks passed, it became clear that the system was responding. Not loudly, not publicly, but decisively. Internal reviews expanded, external consultations were initiated, language in reports became more cautious. Still, no names were attached to any of it. The consequences were collective, and therefore undeniable. People began to sense that something irreversible was underway, even if they couldn't articulate what it was. That's when uncertainty turns into discomfort. And discomfort demands resolution. I didn't know yet how that resolution would come. I only knew that the momentum no longer belonged to me. It belonged to the process I had trusted enough to initiate. Whatever happened next would unfold whether or not anyone ever connected it back to me. And that, strangely, felt like relief. By the time people realized something was truly wrong, the window for quiet correction had already closed. At first, the reaction was denial. Not spoken outright, but expressed through optimism. People reassured one another that the increased scrutiny was temporary, that once the right explanations were provided, things would return to normal. Systems like this always corrected themselves. But systems only self-correct when accountability is optional. I began noticing a change in tone. Meetings grew longer, heavier. Conversations that once ended with confidence now ended with uncertainty. People asked the same questions repeatedly, hoping the answers would change. They didn't. There was a subtle shift from irritation to concern. Requests for documentation became more urgent. Not because anyone had been accused, but because no one could afford to be unprepared anymore. The margin for assumption had disappeared. And once that margin is gone, panic isn't far behind. I saw it in small ways. People stayed later than usual. Emails were sent with increasing formality. Language became defensive, carefully hedged, meticulously qualified. Everyone was trying to protect themselves without admitting they needed protection. The irony was that nothing dramatic had happened yet. No public statements, no announcements, just a tightening of standards. But tightening standards is often enough. At home, the change was more personal. My parents called one evening, their voices unusually tense. They spoke about uncertainty and instability in abstract terms, about how things that once felt secure now feel exposed. They asked questions that weren't really questions, statements searching for reassurance. I listened. At one point, my father said, "You always seem so calm about these things." It wasn't admiration, it was confusion. I told him calmly that clarity made calm possible. Understanding how systems worked helped you anticipate outcomes. There was a pause. For the first time, I sensed that they were realizing something fundamental. They didn't fully understand my world, and they hadn't tried to. The panic, when it came, wasn't explosive. It was quiet, concentrated, and deeply uncomfortable. People began scrambling not to fix the problem, but to reposition themselves in relation to it. That's when you know it's too late. When the focus shifts from resolution to survival, integrity has already lost its leverage. At work, internal discussions grew fragmented. People stopped speaking freely, trust thinned. Everyone was afraid of saying the wrong thing, not because they were guilty, but because uncertainty had replaced confidence. I remained peripheral. No one came to me with accusations. No one suspected me of anything. They still saw me as I had always been, diligent, neutral, and in the background. What they didn't see was that the system no longer needed me. It was moving on its own now. At home, the realization arrived more slowly, but it landed harder. My parents mentioned that they were reconsidering some past decisions. Not apologizing, just reassessing. They spoke about whether they had misjudged certain things. They asked about my work in ways they never had before. Not out of pride, out of necessity. And that was when I understood something quietly devastating. Recognition that arrives only when someone needs you is not recognition at all. It's reclassification. I answered their questions honestly, but without performing expertise. I didn't over-explain. I didn't minimize. I simply spoke as someone who knew what she was talking about. That alone changed the dynamic. They listened differently, more carefully, as if trying to recalibrate a lens that had been out of focus for years. But recalibration doesn't restore lost time. At work, resolution was no longer in anyone's control. External forces had taken over, not with accusations, but with requirements. Standards had been activated, processes engaged, timelines set. There was no single moment where someone said, "We should have fixed this earlier." But the sentiment was everywhere. Too late to explain, too late to adjust, too late to quietly undo what had been normalized for too long. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sober, because this wasn't a victory. It was a consequence, one that affected many people who had never dismissed me, never underestimated me, never said a cruel word. That was the cost of delay, and it reinforced why I had chosen the path I did. Not for recognition, not for power, but waiting for permission to matter allows problems to grow beyond anyone's ability to contain them. By the time panic sets in, the most important choices are already behind you. The confrontation didn't happen in a living room, or at a holiday table, or in the middle of an argument where everyone's emotions were already loud. It happened on a weekday, early evening, the kind of hour when people are tired enough to be honest, but still trying to appear composed. My mother asked if she could stop by. She didn't sound casual. She sounded rehearsed, like someone trying to keep their voice from revealing what their mind had been doing all day. I said yes, and I meant it. Not as permission, as neutrality. They arrived together. That detail mattered to me. My parents had always moved like a unit when they wanted control of a narrative, supporting each other with shared assumptions, shared phrasing, shared certainty. Seeing them at my door, side by side, felt less like a visit and more like a meeting. I made tea, not to soften the moment, but because I didn't want the room to feel staged. Tea was what I always offered. Normality has a way of stripping drama from people who are hoping for it. We sat at my small kitchen table. No television, no music, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the faint traffic outside. My father spoke first. He cleared his throat once, as if that alone might organize his thoughts. "Joan," he said, "we've been hearing things." I didn't ask what things. I didn't pretend ignorance. I simply nodded. My mother leaned forward slightly. "Is it true that there's a review happening? A serious one? People are saying your department is involved." I took a slow breath. Not because I was stalling, but because I wanted to answer accurately. "There is a review," I said. My father's eyes narrowed, not in anger, more in calculation. "And you knew about it?" I met his gaze calmly. I knew some issues needed to be addressed. The silence that followed wasn't explosive. It was dense. It pressed against the edges of the room, forcing them to sit with what they were really asking, without being able to disguise it as casual conversation. My mother's voice softened. "Joan, why didn't you tell us?" I didn't smile, but I wasn't cold either. "Because for a long time, you weren't interested in what I was doing unless it sounded impressive." Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She looked down at her hands. My father tried a different angle. "We didn't mean to—" he started, then stopped, as if the sentence didn't know where to land. I didn't help him. I let him sit with it. After a moment, he said, "We were worried you weren't progressing." That word again, progressing, as if life were only real when it was visible. "I was progressing," I said. "Just not in a way you recognized." My mother's eyes lifted. "We supported you for years." I nodded once. "Until you didn't." Her face tightened, not with rage, but with the quiet pain of being forced to admit a truth that had been framed as reasonable for so long. My father's voice lowered. "We thought you'd be fine. You always seemed fine." I set my cup down gently. I was fine, that wasn't the point. They waited. You could feel it, both of them hoping I would turn this into something emotional, hoping for tears maybe, or an accusation. Something they could respond to, something that would let them play familiar roles. The comforting parent, the misunderstood parent, the wounded parent. But I didn't give them that. Instead, I said, "You decided I was mediocre. And once you decided that, everything you did made sense inside that decision. You stopped asking, you stopped listening, you stopped investing." My father's jaw moved slightly, as if he wanted to disagree, but couldn't find a clean argument. My mother whispered, "We didn't know!" I looked at her, not harshly, just clearly. "You didn't want to know," I said, "because knowing would have required you to update your image of me." That landed. The room went quieter. Not tense, just stripped. There was nothing left to perform around. After a moment, my father said, "Are you saying you did all this because of us?" "No," I answered immediately. "I did it because it was right, and because I could. You were just part of the environment." That sentence startled him, I think. Not because it was cruel, but because it placed them in a role they weren't used to occupying. Not the judges of my life, but a factor in it. My mother swallowed. "So what now?" I didn't rush to reassure them. I didn't punish them with silence either. "Now," I said, "I keep living the life I built. And you can decide whether you want to know me as I am, or keep holding on to the version of me that made you comfortable." My father looked away first. My mother's eyes stayed on me, glassy but controlled. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. I nodded once. "Thank you." Not because everything was healed, not because I suddenly trusted them, but because acknowledgement, even late, deserved to be received with the same calm I had carried through everything else. They left shortly after. No dramatic goodbye, no promise of change, just a quiet departure that felt like the end of a long misunderstanding. When the door closed, I stood still for a moment, listening to the silence settle back into my apartment. It didn't feel lonely. It felt clean. I don't think of myself as someone who won. That word implies a contest, and for most of my life, I wasn't competing with anyone. I was navigating through expectations, through systems, through assumptions that had already been written before I had a chance to speak. Who I am now is not a reaction to my parents or to the people who underestimated me. It's not a polished opposite of the version they once described. It's something quieter than that, more grounded. I am still an accountant. That fact hasn't changed, and I no longer feel the need to defend it. What has changed is how I understand the weight of that role. I work in accountability now, not just in numbers, but in structure, in consequence, in the long-term impact. I understand how decisions echo, how small adjustments can alter outcomes far beyond the moment they're made. My work doesn't look impressive at first glance. It doesn't come with applause or visible milestones, but it shapes things that matter. And I've learned that significance rarely announces itself. I no longer explain my life to people who have already decided what it means. That's perhaps the most important difference. In the past, I was always translating myself, softening my language, minimizing my goals, making sure I didn't sound threatening or arrogant or too much. I thought that was maturity. I thought that was humility. Now, I understand that clarity doesn't require permission. When people ask what I do, I answer simply. If they're curious, I elaborate. If they aren't, I stop. Their understanding is not a prerequisite for my legitimacy. My relationship with my parents exists in a new shape. It's calmer, but also more honest. We don't pretend anymore. They no longer speak about my life as if it's finished. They ask questions now, real ones, and when they don't understand the answers, they admit it. That shift didn't come from confrontation, it came from consequence. I don't rely on them emotionally the way I once did. Not out of bitterness, but out of realism. They are part of my life, not the measure of it. I care about them, but I no longer contort myself to maintain their comfort. That space has allowed something else to grow. I trust myself now, not in an abstract motivational sense, but in a procedural one. I trust my judgment, my pacing, my restraint. I trust that if something feels off, it probably is, and that if something matters, it will still matter tomorrow. So there's no need to rush into noise. This trust has changed how I move through the world. I choose silence more often, but not because I feel small, because I know when speaking adds value and when it simply adds sound. I don't correct people reflexively. I don't chase acknowledgement. I don't explain my boundaries. I let my consistency do the explaining. People treat me differently now, though not in a dramatic way. There's more caution, more listening, fewer assumptions. I don't command rooms, but I influence outcomes, quietly, reliably. And when recognition comes, and it does, sometimes, it arrives without ceremony. A name mentioned in the right context. A call asking for perspective, not permission. an invitation to contribute at a level that doesn't require justification. I don't savor those moments. I respect them. Because I know how long it takes to build something that doesn't collapse under scrutiny. If there's one thing I've realized completely, it's the need to be seen as exceptional. Exceptionalism is fragile. It depends on comparison, on performance, on constant reinforcement. I prefer being durable. Durable work, durable relationships, durable self-respect. I no longer shrink to be useful, and I no longer expand to be impressive. I occupy exactly the space my work requires, and no more. That balance took time to learn. Sometimes when I think back to the version of myself my parents once described, mediocre, stable, unremarkable, I don't feel anger, I feel distance. She was doing her best with the information she had. She didn't know yet that being underestimated could become a kind of shelter, that silence could become a tool. I carry her with me, not as a wound but as context. Because who I am now exists precisely because of what I endured without applause. I'm not louder, I'm not bolder in obvious ways. I'm simply aligned. And alignment, I've learned, is what allows you to move through the world without needing to prove that you belong in it. There's a temptation, when a story like this reaches its end, to search for a clean moral. Something sharp, something easily shareable, a sentence that turns years of quiet tension into a lesson neat enough to feel satisfying. But real lives don't resolve that way. What I've learned isn't that patience always pays off, or that being underestimated is secretly a gift. Both of those ideas can become excuses for staying too small for too long. Silence on its own doesn't make you strong. Endurance by itself doesn't make you right. What matters is why you stay quiet, and what you're doing while you are. For a long time, I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I stayed steady enough, if I avoided conflict and proved my reliability, the people closest to me would eventually see me clearly. That clarity would arrive as recognition, support, maybe even pride. It didn't. And that realization was painful, but it was also freeing. Because once I stopped waiting to be understood, I started acting with intention, not to be seen, but to be correct, not to be admired, but to be aligned with what I knew was true. Recognition, when it finally came, arrived long after doubt had done its work. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt inevitable. And by then, I no longer needed it to validate anything inside me. That's the part people don't talk about enough. Delayed recognition doesn't heal old wounds by itself. What heals them is the internal shift that happens before recognition ever arrives. The moment you stop organizing your life around someone else's definition of significance. My parents didn't suddenly become different people. They didn't transform overnight into perfect, affirming figures. What changed was the balance of influence. Their doubt no longer shaped my choices. Their approval was no longer a requirement for my peace. And because of that, when acknowledgement finally surfaced, publicly, unmistakably, it didn't inflate me. It simply confirmed something I had already built quietly, without witnesses. If there is a moral here, it's this. Being underestimated will either shrink you or sharpen you. But the outcome depends on whether you internalize the dismissal or outgrow the need to respond to it. You don't owe the world a performance of your worth. You don't owe your family a version of success they can easily explain to others. And you don't owe anyone proof before you're allowed to take yourself seriously. Some people will only recognize your value when it becomes useful to them. That doesn't make the recognition meaningless, but it does mean you shouldn't build your life waiting for it. The most dangerous thing about being quietly dismissed isn't the dismissal itself. It's how easily you can start agreeing with it. And the most powerful thing you can do isn't to prove anyone wrong loudly, but to become so grounded in your own alignment that their doubt loses its leverage entirely. If you're listening to this, and you've ever been labeled stable, safe, fine, or not ambitious, especially by people who should have known you better, know this. Your pace is not your ceiling, your silence is not your absence, and your worth does not require an audience to be real. So I'll leave you with one final question, not rhetorical, not dramatic, just honest. In your life, whose definition of enough are you still living under? And what might change if you quietly let it go? If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments.